dust choked the bustling streets of Cheyenne in the summer of 1883, a ruthless railroad town where desperation usually bought cheap labor. Yet, one stranded woman stood firm, rejecting 3 guaranteed paychecks in a single afternoon, watching from a shaded boardwalk. A rugged rancher finally stepped forward to ask the ultimate question. The Wyoming sun beat down on the wooden planks of 16th Street like a blacksmith's hammer. Josephine Miller stepped off the Union Pacific platform with nothing but a battered leather valise and 32 cents to her name. Her blue wool traveling dress, once the height of Chicago fashion, was now heavy with the gray dust of a 3-day train ride. She was alone, running from a nightmare she dared not name, and entirely out of options. Across the street, leaning against the sturdy oak pillars of the Cheyenne National Bank, stood Bo Montgomery. Bo was a man carved from the harsh landscape of the Laramie Mountains. At 34, he owned the sprawling Ironwood Ranch, commanding a herd of 2,000 head of cattle and a dozen hardened ranch hands. He was in town to negotiate a freight contract, but his attention had shifted from cattle prices to the lone woman navigating the chaotic thoroughfare. There was a desperate stiffness to her posture, a rigid pride that Bo rarely saw in the transient souls washing up in Cheyenne. He struck a match against his boot heel, lit a cheroot, and watched her work. Josephine's first stop was the Painted Lady Saloon, the largest establishment in town, owned by a notoriously shrewd businessman named Josiah Higgins. Bo watched through the saloon's large plate-glass window. He couldn't hear the words, but the pantomime was clear enough. Josephine had laid her hands flat on the polished mahogany bar, speaking earnestly to Higgins. She was likely offering to manage his ledgers. Bo could see the ink stains permanently etched into the sides of her fingers, the hallmark of a professional clerk. Higgins, a man whose wealth was built on the exploitation of the desperate, merely laughed. He reached out, taking a lock of Josephine's dark hair, and pointed toward the velvet-draped stage in the corner. He wasn't looking for a bookkeeper. He was looking for an attraction. Josephine didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply slapped Higgins's hand away with a resounding crack that echoed over the piano music, picked up her valise, and walked out the swinging doors. Bo's eyebrows raised in quiet, impressed amusement. 10 minutes later, Josephine entered Peterson's Dry Goods. Lyle Peterson was a weasel of a man who controlled the town's primary supply line. Bo crossed the street, pretending to inspect a display of saddles outside the shop to listen in. "I can do inventory, Mr. Peterson." Josephine's voice drifted through the open door, strained but steady. "I handled the shipping manifests for one of the largest mercantile firms in Illinois. I can spot a discrepancy a mile away." "That's real nice, little lady," Peterson drawled, his tone dripping with patronizing grease. "But I don't need a fancy ledger girl. I need a stock girl. You'll work 6 days a week, 14 hours a day, $2 a week, and you'll sleep in the cot in the back room. I've got the only key to the deadbolt to keep the merchandise safe. You understand? You'll have to rely on my goodwill." The silence that followed was heavy. The implication was as subtle as a loaded shotgun. "I would rather starve in the street than be locked in a room under your goodwill, Mr. Peterson," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a frigid whisper. "You will starve, you arrogant little fool." Peterson spat as she turned on her heel. Bo stepped aside as she marched out of the store, her knuckles white around the handle of her bag. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale, but her chin remained defiantly high. 2. Her final attempt was at Mrs. Beatrice Gable's boarding house. Beatrice was a formidable widow, known for working her girls to the bone. This time, Beau watched from the shade of the livery stable. The negotiation happened on the front porch. Beatrice looked Josephine up and down, sneering at her dusty but high-quality dress. "I don't hire runaways playing dress-up," Beatrice barked. "But I'm short a laundress. You'll scrub sheets till your hands bleed. No wages for the first 6 months. Just a roof over your head and 2 meals a day. If you make it to winter without crying, I'll start paying you $1 a week. Say it." Josephine swayed slightly, the lack of food and the oppressive heat finally taking their toll. She looked at the bubbling cauldrons of lye soap in the side yard, then at the hard, unyielding face of the older woman. For a split second, Beau thought she was going to break. Survival often demanded the surrender of dignity. Instead, Josephine tightened her grip on her valise. "I am looking for employment, Mum. Not indentured servitude." "Then go back to wherever you came from," Beatrice yelled as Josephine descended the porch steps. "This town eats women like you alive." 3. Josephine walked blindly until she reached the end of the boardwalk, leaning heavily against a hitching post. She closed her eyes, the facade finally cracking as a single, frustrated tear cut a clean line down her dust-covered cheek. She had 32 cents. It wasn't enough for a ticket out, barely enough for a decent meal. Beau dropped his cigar into the dirt and crushed it beneath his boot. He had seen enough. He had seen greenhorns break. He had seen tough men compromise their morals for a hot meal. But he had never seen someone turn down survival 3 times in an hour out of sheer, unadulterated self-respect. He stepped out of the shadows, his silver spurs jingling softly against the hard-packed earth. Josephine jumped as the shadow of a tall, broad-shouldered man fell over her. She turned, instantly defensive, her hand instinctively reaching toward the heavy iron hairpin hidden in the folds of her skirt. "I watched you walk away from Higgins, Peterson, and the Gable widow," Beau said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that demanded attention, but lacked the predatory edge of the other men she had met today. He tipped his Stetson back, revealing piercing hazel eyes that seemed to look right through her. "That's a lot of pride for a woman who looks like she hasn't eaten since Nebraska." Josephine bristled, lifting her chin. "My appetite is none of your concern, mister, and neither is my business. When a woman turns down 3 paying jobs in a town where people kill for a silver dollar, it becomes a curiosity," Beau replied, leaning casually against the hitching post. "So, I have to ask, what kind of work are you looking for?" Josephine studied him. He wore a canvas duster over a finely tailored but dust-covered vest. His hands were calloused, his jaw shadowed with a few days' stubble, and a Colt .45 rested naturally on his hip. He wasn't a town merchant. He was a man of the land. "I am looking for honest work," Josephine said, her voice remarkably steady despite her exhaustion. "Work where the wage is paid in coin, not in compromises. Work where my mind is valued over my compliance. I am a master bookkeeper, sir. I can manage supply logistics, payroll, and banking ledgers for any business making over $50,000 a quarter. But in this town, it seems the only qualification that matters for a woman is how low she is willing to bow." Beau let out a low whistle. 50,000 a quarter. She wasn't just a clerk, she was high-level management. "My name is Beau Montgomery," he said, extending a gloved hand. "I own the Ironwood Ranch, about 20 miles north of here. I run 2,000 head of beef. I supply beef to the army forts, and I have a lumber contract with the railroad. My foreman is a genius with cattle, but he can't add 2 and 2 without taking off his boots. My books are a disaster. I need a ledger keeper." Josephine hesitated, looking at his outstretched hand. "And where would I sleep?" "Mr. Montgomery, does your ranch have a deadbolt that only you hold the key to?" Beau's expression hardened, a flash of genuine anger in his eyes, not at her, but at what she had endured to ask such a question. "You'd sleep in the foreman's old cabin. It has a heavy oak door, and you'd have the only key. I don't buy women." "Miss Miller," she said cautiously. "Josephine Miller. I don't buy women. Miss Miller, I hire professionals. $40 a month, room and board included. But if you mess up my numbers, you're walking back to Cheyenne." $40 a month was a fortune. It was more than enough to disappear, to build a new life where Theodore Maxwell, her corrupt and dangerous former employer in Chicago, could never find her. "Before I accept, Mr. Montgomery," Josephine said, her stomach rumbling loudly enough for him to hear, "I require a sign-on bonus, a steak, medium rare, and a cup of black coffee." A slow grin spread across Beau's rugged face. "Deal. Let's get you fed." He escorted her to the Cheyenne Cattleman's Diner, a respectable establishment far away from the saloon district, as Josephine devoured the steak with a fierce, ravenous grace. Beau laid a leather-bound ledger on the table. It was filled with messy, scrawled handwriting and smeared ink. "Prove it," Beau challenged gently, sipping his coffee. "Find the hole in my June quarter." Josephine wiped her mouth with a napkin, pulled a graphite pencil from her valise, and pulled the book toward her. Her demeanor shifted instantly. The exhausted, frightened runaway vanished, replaced by a razor-sharp professional. Her eyes darted down the columns. Less than 3 minutes later, she circled a number. "Here," she said, sliding the book back. "Your cattle buyer claimed a shrinkage rate of 10% during transport to Omaha, but the rail manifest weight you paid freight on doesn't match the slaughterhouse payout. He's skimming off the top by misreporting the head count weight at the destination. He stole roughly $600 from you last month." Beau stared at the circled number. He had spent 3 agonizing nights trying to figure out why his profits were light. She found it in 3 minutes. "Well, I'll be damned," Beau muttered. "Miss Miller, you are officially hired." Josephine allowed herself a small, genuine smile. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. But the hope was violently short-lived. The brass bell above the diner door jingled violently. 2 men walked in. The first was a local deputy, but it was the second man who made the blood freeze in Josephine's veins. He wore a pristine gray suit that looked completely out of place in Wyoming. He had cold, flat gray eyes and a neatly trimmed mustache. It was Arthur Pendleton, Theodore Maxwell's chief fixer and enforcer from Chicago. Josephine gasped, instinctively shrinking back into the corner of the wooden booth, pulling her hat down to shield her face. Beau's instincts flared. He didn't turn around, but he watched the reflection of the 2 men in the glass of the window beside them. He felt the sudden, terrifying shift in the woman sitting across from him. The tough, proud bookkeeper was suddenly shaking like a leaf in a winter gale. "Deputy," Arthur's voice carried across the quiet diner, smooth and deadly. "I assure you, the warrant is fully authorized by the governor of Illinois. The woman is a master thief. She absconded with over $10,000 of my employer's funds. I have reason to believe she arrived on the noon train." Arthur pulled a piece of parchment from his breast pocket and unfolded it. It was a remarkably accurate sketch of Josephine. Bo looked at Josephine. Her face was ashen. "I didn't steal it," she whispered frantically, leaning across the table, her voice trembling. "I found the ghost accounts. Maxwell was laundering money for the Chicago syndicate. I found the proof, and I took the ledgers to protect myself. If they take me back, I'm dead. They'll kill me before I ever see a courtroom." Bo looked at her. He had known this woman for exactly an hour. She could be lying. She could be a master con artist, playing him for a fool. But then he remembered the way she had slapped Josiah Higgins, the way she had chosen starvation over compromising her dignity in Peterson's back room. A common thief wouldn't have done that. A thief would have taken the easiest mark. Arthur Pendleton and the deputy were slowly making their way down the aisle of the diner, checking the faces of the patrons. They were 3 tables away. "Miss Miller," Bo said, his voice dropping to a calm, authoritative murmur. "Take off your hat." "What? Take off your hat, unpin your hair, and slide over here. Now." Josephine didn't have time to argue. She pulled her hat off, yanking the heavy iron hairpin free so her dark hair tumbled down around her shoulders, dramatically altering her silhouette. She slid out of her side of the booth and slid in right next to Bo. "Put your head on my shoulder," Bo commanded softly. "And whatever happens, do not speak." As Arthur and the deputy stepped up to their table, Bo casually draped his heavy arm around Josephine's shoulders, pulling her close. The smell of leather, tobacco, and clean sweat enveloped her. She buried her face against the canvas of his duster, closing her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Excuse me, sir," the deputy said, clearing his throat. "We're looking for a woman from Chicago, traveling alone." Bo looked up, his expression one of mild, dangerous annoyance. He slowly took a sip of his coffee. "Does it look like she's traveling alone?" "Deputy," Bo asked, his voice a low, warning rumble. Arthur stepped forward, his cold eyes narrowing as he tried to get a look at Josephine's hidden face. "If you wouldn't mind, sir. We just need the young lady to look up for a moment. Official business." Bo shifted his weight, his right hand dropping casually beneath the table, resting squarely on the ivory grip of his Colt .45. He locked eyes with the Chicago enforcer, the hardened, lethal edge of a man who tamed wild frontiers fully coming to the surface. "This is my wife," Bo lied, his voice echoing with absolute, terrifying conviction. "And she's resting. Now, you boys are interrupting our supper. I suggest you take your official business elsewhere, before my business becomes official with you." The diner fell dead silent. The silence in the Cheyenne cattleman's diner was stretched so taut it threatened to snap. Arthur Pendleton's flat grey eyes remained fixed on Bo Montgomery, calculating the odds. Pendleton was a man accustomed to compliance, armed with the backing of Chicago's most ruthless crime syndicate. But he was also a pragmatist. He recognized the heavy, uncompromising stillness of a frontier man who had survived Indian raids and brutal winters. The local deputy nervously cleared his throat, leaning close to the Chicago enforcer. "Mr. Pendleton," the deputy whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "That's Bo Montgomery. He supplies the beef to Fort D. Russell. He's got friends in the territorial legislature and a dozen armed riders who'd burn this town down if he asked. If he says the woman is his wife, we best leave it be." Pendleton's jaw tightened. He offered a tight, artificial smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My apologies. Mr. Montgomery, a misunderstanding. Enjoy your supper." He tipped his hat and walked out, the deputy hurrying out behind him like a scolded dog. Bo didn't move a muscle until he saw them cross the street through the window. Only then did he exhale, his hand leaving the butt of his Colt. Beside him, Josephine sagged against the booth, her breath escaping in a ragged gasp. "They aren't gone," she whispered, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. "Arthur Pendleton doesn't give up. He'll check the county marriage records. He'll ask the telegraph operator. By morning, he'll know you lied." "Then we won't be here in the morning," Bo said, throwing a silver dollar onto the table. "Grab your valise. Miss Miller, your employment at the Ironwood begins tonight." They slipped out the back door of the diner into the cool, star-strewn Wyoming night. Bo retrieved his wagon from the livery, hiding Josephine under a heavy wool blanket in the back until they were miles outside the city limits. As the lights of Cheyenne faded into the distance, the vast, empty prairie opened up before them, bathed in the silver light of a full moon. Josephine sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders against the biting night air. She watched Bo's broad back as he drove the team of horses, his silhouette strong and unyielding. He was a complete stranger, yet he had risked his life and reputation for her without a second thought. "Why did you do it?" she asked over the rhythmic thud of hooves. "You could have handed me over. You owe me nothing." Bo didn't turn around, keeping his eyes on the rutted dirt road. "Out here, a man's worth is measured by who he protects, not who he sells out. Besides, you found the leak in my accounts. Good bookkeepers are harder to find than honest deputies." They arrived at the Ironwood Ranch just before dawn. It was a sprawling, formidable compound set against the rugged foothills of the Laramie Mountains. True to his word, Bo set her up in the sturdy log cabin previously used by his foreman. It was sparse but clean, and the heavy iron deadbolt on the inside of the door offered a comfort Josephine hadn't felt in weeks. For the next 5 days, Josephine threw herself into the work. She organized Bo's disastrous ledgers, implemented a double-entry accounting system, and fired the corrupt cattle buyer via a sharply worded telegraph sent through the ranch's private line to Laramie. But as she dug deeper into the financial landscape of the region, comparing Bo's accounts with regional banking bulletins she had brought from Chicago, a terrifying pattern emerged. Late on the 5th night, she marched across the dusty compound to the main ranch house. Bo was at his massive oak desk, cleaning his rifle. "It wasn't just money laundering," Josephine said, dropping her heavy leather valise onto his desk and pulling out the stolen Chicago ledgers. "I didn't understand what Theodore Maxwell was doing with the clean money until I looked at your property lines." Bo set the rifle down, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" "Josephine, Maxwell's syndicate isn't just hiding cash. They are aggressively buying up dummy corporations in Wyoming," she explained, rapidly pointing to columns of numbers. "Specifically, they are buying up the water rights along the Chugwater Creek. They've already quietly purchased the debts of 3 ranches bordering the Swan Land and Cattle Company Alexander Swan's territory, and they just bought the promissory note on the eastern ridge of your property from the Territorial Bank." Bo's face went pale. Without the water access on the eastern ridge, his herd would die of thirst before the end of summer. "Pendleton isn't just here to kill me," Josephine realized, the blood draining from her face. "He's here to finalize the hostile takeover, and I have the only ledger that proves the money used to buy those notes was obtained illegally through extortion and racketeering. If this ledger reaches a federal judge, their entire land grab is nullified. Before Beau could process the magnitude of this revelation, the haunting sound of a galloping horse tore through the night. The ranch's night watchman burst through the door. Out of breath. "Boss," the cowboy panted. "Dust cloud coming up the southern road. Looks like a dozen riders. And they're riding hard." The morning sun crept over the Laramie Mountains, casting long, menacing shadows across the ironwood courtyard. Beau stood on the wide front porch of the main house, a Winchester, repeating rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. Flanking him were 8 of his toughest ranch hands, all armed, their faces set in grim determination. In the center of the courtyard, Arthur Pendleton brought his roan stallion to a halt. Behind him sat 11 men. A few were corrupt local deputies, but most were hardened mercenaries carrying papers from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, hired guns cloaked in corporate authority. "Morning. Mr. Montgomery," Pendleton called out, his voice carrying the arrogant sting of a man holding a winning hand. "I see you brought your friends, but this doesn't need to be a bloody affair. I have a federal warrant for the arrest of Josephine Miller and a foreclosure notice for the eastern ridge of the Ironwood Ranch. Hand over the woman, and we'll leave you to your dry dirt." "The eastern ridge belongs to Ironwood," Beau yelled back, his voice booming like thunder. "And the lady is under my protection." "Your protection means nothing against the federal government," Pendleton sneered, pulling a rolled parchment from his saddlebag. The front door of the ranch house creaked open. Josephine stepped out onto the porch, standing shoulder to shoulder with Beau. She had discarded her dusty travel clothes for a simple, practical riding skirt and a white cotton blouse. She looked radiant, fearless, and utterly transformed from the terrified woman in the diner. "You don't represent the federal government." "Arthur," Josephine said, her voice ringing clear across the yard. "You represent Theodore Maxwell's criminal enterprise, and that warrant is built on perjury." Pendleton laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Strong words from a runaway thief. Boys, go get her." The mercenaries shifted in their saddles, hands dropping to their holsters. Beau cocked the lever of his Winchester. The metallic clack-clack echoed loudly, a stark warning that the first man to draw would die. "I wouldn't do that," Josephine cautioned, stepping to the edge of the porch. She pulled a telegraph receipt from her pocket and held it up. 3 days ago, I took a ride to the local telegraph office. I sent a detailed message to you, Ace, Marshal Frank Canton in Cheyenne, outlining the syndicate's money laundering scheme, including the illegal purchase of Wyoming water rights. Pendleton's arrogant smile faltered, but I didn't stop there. Josephine continued, her confidence soaring as she watched the Chicago enforcer squirm. "I mailed the original ledger, the proof of your boss's extortion, directly to Judge Isaac Parker's federal court via armed courier. By now, the Justice Department is well aware that the funds used to purchase the Ironwood promissory notes are fraudulent. You're lying," Pendleton spat, though a bead of sweat now trickled down his temple. "Am I?" Josephine countered. "Look behind you, Arthur." A low rumble shook the ground. Over the southern ridge, a new contingent of riders appeared. But these men weren't mercenaries. They rode in perfect military formation, carrying the unmistakable guidon flag of the United States Cavalry, accompanied by a man in a dark suit wearing a silver star. Marshal Canton had received the message. Pendleton looked at the approaching cavalry, then back at Beau's heavily armed men. The calculation in his cold grey eyes shifted from victory to sheer survival. Without a word, he violently spurred his horse, turning tail and galloping furiously back toward Cheyenne, leaving his hired Pinkertons and the confused deputies to face the federal marshal alone. Bo lowered his rifle, letting out a long, heavy breath as his ranch hands erupted into triumphant cheers. The hostile takeover was dead, and Maxwell's syndicate was about to face the full wrath of the federal government. He turned to Josephine, who was suddenly trembling, the adrenaline rapidly leaving her system. He reached out, his rough, calloused hand gently cupping her face, his thumb brushing away a stray tear of relief. "You saved the ironwood," Bo said softly, his hazel eyes filled with a profound, consuming reverence. "You saved my home, Josephine." "You gave me a home to save, Bo," she whispered, leaning into his touch. Bo smiled, a slow, breathtaking curve of his lips. He stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. "You know, the local deputy is going to be asking a lot of questions. He still thinks you're my wife." Josephine looked up into the rugged, handsome face of the man who had risked everything for a stranger on a dusty street. "Then perhaps," she murmured, a mischievous spark dancing in her blue eyes, "we should make sure he isn't entirely wrong." Bo didn't need to be told twice. He brought his lips down to hers, sealing a partnership born in desperation, forged in fire, and bound by a love as wild and enduring as the western frontier. If you enjoyed this thrilling tale of Wild West romance, courage, and untamed justice, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button to show your support. Share this story with fellow romance and history lovers, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more epic, dramatic stories of love and survival. Drop a comment below. Would you have turned down those jobs like Josephine?